Anneliese Michel's story begins in a quiet corner of Bavaria, in the small town of Klingenberg. Born on September 21, 1952, to Joseph and Anna Michel, Anneliese grew up in a household where faith wasn't just a belief. It was a way of life. The Michels were devout Catholics, attending Mass twice a week, their home filled with the symbols and rituals of their religion. But beneath the surface of their piety lay a shadow, a secret that shaped the family's faith and ultimately Anneliese's tragic path. Anna Michel carried the weight of her past like a penance. Years before Anneliese was born, Anna had given birth to an illegitimate daughter, Martha, a fact that brought deep shame upon the family and their conservative, religious community. When Anna married Joseph, she wore a black veil over her wedding gown, a symbol of her repentance. This act of contrition defined her life going forward, and in many ways shaped the upbringing of her children. For Anna, suffering was a path to redemption. She believed that faith was not just about prayer and devotion, but about sacrifice and atonement. This belief was deeply instilled in her daughters, especially Anneliese, who grew up in an environment where guilt and penance were as much a part of life as daily prayer. Anneliese was encouraged to offer her discomfort to God as a form of spiritual purification. It was not unusual for her to sleep on a bare stone floor, fasting and praying as an act of atonement for the world's sins. But even as the Michels adhered strictly to their faith, tragedy struck the family. Martha, Anna's first daughter, died at the age of 8 due to complications from a kidney operation. Her death left a deep scar on the family, a silence that lingered in their home and in their hearts. Anna, convinced that Martha's death was part of a divine plan, doubled down on her faith. She prayed fervently, clinging to the belief that suffering brought one closer to God. Anneliese, deeply sensitive and devout, absorbed her mother's teachings. She saw the world through the lens of her family's faith, interpreting every hardship as a test, every moment of pain as an opportunity for redemption. By the time she reached her teenage years, she had fully embraced her role as the family's spiritual anchor. Her classmates described her as quiet, withdrawn, and deeply religious. Anneliese was the kind of girl who seemed almost too good for the world around her, dedicated to her faith in a way that set her apart. But it was during these years that the first signs of trouble began to appear. At the age of 16, Anneliese experienced her first convulsion. It came without warning, a sudden and terrifying event that left her disoriented and confused. She was diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that caused seizures, memory loss, and in some cases hallucinations. Her doctors prescribed anticonvulsant medication, hoping to manage her symptoms, but the seizures continued. Over the next few years, Anneliese's condition worsened. She began to experience vivid hallucinations and bouts of severe depression. She saw faces that weren't there, heard voices whispering terrible things in her ears. These voices told her she was damned, that she would rot in hell, that she was beyond salvation. Anneliese confided in her family and doctors, but no one seemed to have answers. The medication didn't help. The prayers didn't help. The voices persisted, and so did the darkness that seemed to envelop her. By the time she reached her early 20s, Anneliese's struggles had become impossible to ignore. She became intolerant of religious symbols, unable to look at crucifixes or walk past Christian shrines. On a pilgrimage to San Damiano, a site of religious significance, Anneliese reportedly found herself unable to approach the shrine. She described the soil as burning beneath her feet, the images of saints as too blinding to look at. To those around her, it seemed as though she was rejecting everything she had once held sacred. Her family began to suspect that something more sinister was at play. This was not just epilepsy, they believed. This was something darker, something spiritual. They turned to the church for help, reaching out to local priests to request an exorcism. But their pleas were met with skepticism. The priests recommended that Anneliese continue her medical treatment, insisting that she didn't meet the criteria for possession. Without approval from the bishop, there could be no exorcism, but Anneliese's condition continued to spiral. She became more withdrawn, more isolated, her behavior growing increasingly erratic. She injured herself, drank her own urine, and ate insects. Her weight dropped dramatically as she began to refuse food. And still the voices persisted. By 1975, after years of suffering, the family found a priest who believed them. Father Ernst Alt, a man deeply convinced of the existence of demonic possession, agreed to help. He wrote to the local bishop, Joseph Stengel, petitioning for permission to perform an exorcism. The bishop granted the request, assigning another priest, Father Arnold Renz, to assist Alt. Together, they began what would become a harrowing and ultimately tragic attempt to save Anneliese Michel. The exorcisms began in September of that year, conducted in secret within the Michel family home. Over the course of 10 months, Anneliese endured 67 sessions, each lasting several hours. The priests recited prayers, chanted ancient rites, and confronted the supposed demons that they believed had taken hold of her. Anneliese, frail and emaciated, fought back, her body convulsing, her voice growling in a way that seemed almost inhuman. The events that followed would haunt all those involved, casting a long shadow over the small town of Klingenberg and sparking a debate that continues to this day. Was Anneliese Michel truly possessed, or was she a young woman failed by those who should have cared for her? As the exorcisms intensified, so did the suffering, and Anneliese's story would soon take a devastating turn. The exorcisms of Anneliese Michel began on September 24th, 1975. What unfolded over the next 10 months would be nothing short of horrific. A clash between ancient religious rites and a young woman's deteriorating mind and body. Fathers Ernst Alt and Arnold Renz, armed with the authority of the Catholic Church and the age-old Ritual Romanum, took their places as spiritual warriors, ready to confront the forces they believed were tormenting Anneliese. What they could not predict was the toll it would take on everyone involved. By this time, Anneliese had become a shadow of the vibrant, devout girl she once was. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow, her body reduced to a skeletal form. At just 23 years old, she weighed a mere 68 pounds. She was weak, yet her strength in the moments of the exorcisms would terrify even the most seasoned among them. Father Alt described her voice as guttural and inhuman, as if it belonged to a creature far removed from the frail woman before him. The words that poured out of her were laced with obscenities and blasphemies, often in multiple voices that seemed to argue with each other. Her body contorted in ways that seemed impossible, her hands clawing at the air as though battling invisible forces. The priests asked the demons to identify themselves, and one by one, they claimed their names: Lucifer, Cain, Judas Iscariot, Adolf Hitler, Nero, and Fleischmann, the last being a disgraced priest. Each demon spoke through Anneliese, their voices growling, mocking, and hostile. Tapes recorded during these sessions captured their chilling arguments. Lucifer declared his dominion over her soul, while Judas berated him as nothing more than a braggart with no real power. Even Adolf Hitler's voice, chillingly precise with its Austrian inflections, echoed through the room, leaving those present in stunned silence. As the exorcisms progressed, the priests and her family became increasingly convinced of the demonic presence. For them, these weren't the symptoms of epilepsy or mental illness. These were spiritual battles, evidence of the devil's grip on Anneliese. She would gnash her teeth, spit, and growl at the sight of a crucifix. Sacred objects sent her into fits of rage, her screams reverberating through the walls of the Michel family home. For hours on end, her body was restrained to prevent her from injuring herself or others. The toll on Anneliese was unimaginable. Her body bore the marks of her suffering, bruises, cuts, and wounds from self-inflicted harm. Her knees were swollen and bloodied from constant genuflections, her tendons strained to the breaking point. She was compelled to perform over 400 squats a day, each one an act of penance that brought her closer to collapse. Her voice grew hoarse from screaming, her breath labored from the exertion, and yet she begged for more. I want to suffer for the sins of the world, she told Father Renz during one session. I want to atone for the lost youth, for the priests who have turned away from God. These words, spoken through cracked lips and sunken eyes, only solidified the priest's resolve. For them, Anneliese was a martyr, chosen by God to endure this suffering as a warning to the world. But to the outside world, the events in the Michel home remained a secret. The exorcisms were conducted in complete isolation, away from prying eyes and skeptical minds. The church had ordered secrecy, fearing the scrutiny of modern society, and so, for 10 months, the small town of Klingenberg was unaware of the horrors unfolding behind closed doors. Anneliese's condition worsened with each passing day. She stopped eating entirely, convinced that food was unholy, that it would feed the demons inside her. Her body began to waste away, her skin pale and stretched thin over her bones. Pneumonia set in, but still she pressed on, insisting that the exorcisms were working, that she could feel the demons weakening. Her family, desperate to save her, clung to this belief. They refused to call for medical help, convinced that only the power of God could heal her. The strain on the priests was evident as well. Father Renz, a man of faith and conviction, found himself shaken by the ordeal. He had performed exorcisms before, but none like this. The sheer intensity of Anneliese's possession, the violence with which the demons fought back, left him questioning his own strength. Father Alt, too, bore the weight of the sessions, his once confident demeanor giving way to exhaustion and doubt. Yet both men remained steadfast, determined to see the battle through to the end. The tapes of the exorcisms, recorded as evidence of the possession, captured the full extent of Anneliese's torment. In one session, she growled and screamed for hours, her voice a cacophony of rage and despair. The priests recited prayers, their voices steady yet tinged with desperation. The words of the Ritual Romanum filled the room, a battle cry against the darkness that had consumed her. Vade retro Satana, Father Renz commanded. Go back, Satan. But the demons only laughed. One particularly harrowing session revealed the demons' manipulation. They spoke of Anneliese's suffering, mocking her pain, taunting her with visions of hell. They told her that her prayers were useless, that God had abandoned her. And yet, in these moments of despair, Anneliese would whisper prayers through her tears, her faith unbroken even as her body gave way. As the weeks turned to months, the question loomed over the Michel family and the priests: how much more could Anneliese endure? Her parents, Joseph and Anna, were racked with guilt and helplessness. They watched as their daughter faded before their eyes, her once kind and gentle face now gaunt and hollow. They wanted to believe that the exorcisms were working, that their suffering was not in vain. But doubt began to creep in. The turning point came in early 1976 when Anneliese confided in her mother. "Mother," she whispered, her voice weak and trembling, "I'm afraid." These words, spoken with a childlike vulnerability, shattered Anna Michel's resolve. She wanted to help her daughter, to save her from this nightmare, but she didn't know how. The priests insisted that the battle was nearly won, that the demons were losing their grip, but Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and she was right. By the spring of 1976, Anneliese's body was failing. She was too weak to stand, her movements sluggish and labored. Her voice, once strong and defiant, had been reduced to a faint whisper. Yet still, the exorcisms continued, the priests convinced that they were on the brink of a breakthrough. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that Anneliese was running out of time. Her body, battered and broken, could no longer sustain her, and yet her faith remained unshaken. "I will die for their sins," she told Father Alt during one of the final sessions. "I will die for the lost." In her mind, she was a martyr, chosen by God to suffer for the salvation of others. But to those around her, she was a young woman caught in a battle she could not win, a victim of forces both spiritual and human. The final chapter of Anneliese Michel's life was about to unfold, and the cost of her faith would soon become all too clear. By early summer 1976, Anneliese Michel's frail body was nearing its breaking point. Her condition had deteriorated to a state that could no longer be ignored, even by those convinced of her possession. The exorcisms had stretched over 10 grueling months, with nearly 70 sessions conducted. Anneliese's physical and mental suffering was insurmountable, and the strain had begun to ripple outward, consuming the lives of those who surrounded her. In the Michel household, the air was thick with tension. The priests, Father Alt and Father Renz, continued their rituals with growing urgency, reciting the Ritual Romanum in a battle they believed was spiritual. Yet it was becoming increasingly clear that this war had a very real human cost. Anneliese's parents, Joseph and Anna, vacillated between despair and stubborn faith. They clung to the belief that their daughter's suffering had a divine purpose, that she was enduring this torment as an offering for the sins of the world. For Anneliese, the lines between reality and the supernatural had blurred entirely. Her once vivid hallucinations had evolved into a constant nightmare. She would wake screaming in the night, her thin voice filling the house with guttural cries that sounded less human with each passing day. Her skin was pale, her bones sharp beneath the stretched, paper-thin surface. Her knees were bruised and bloodied from endless genuflections, the joints swollen and stiff from injury. And yet she persevered, convinced that her agony had meaning. The priests had become increasingly desperate. The demons that spoke through Anneliese during the exorcisms mocked them relentlessly, their voices rasping and cruel. "You will never win," they snarled. "She belongs to us." The priests responded with the force of their faith, their chants rising in defiance against the cacophony of screams and growls. But the progress they had hoped for seemed elusive, and the weight of their failure pressed heavily upon them. Behind closed doors, cracks began to form in their resolve. Father Renz, who had always presented himself as the more composed of the two, found himself questioning the effectiveness of their efforts. The demons' taunts haunted him even outside of the sessions, their voices whispering in the corners of his mind. Father Alt, who had been the first to advocate for the exorcism, now found himself grappling with guilt. He could not shake the image of Anneliese's emaciated frame, the sight of her eyes, once full of life, now hollow and sunken. The strain extended beyond the Michel household. The neighbors, though largely unaware of the specifics, could not ignore the sounds that emanated from the house. The screams, the banging, the strange and guttural voices. They whispered among themselves, casting uneasy glances toward the Michel home. The small Bavarian town of Klingenberg, typically quiet and reserved, was now alive with rumors and fear. By June, Anneliese's condition had become critical. She was no longer able to walk, her body too weak to bear her weight. Her parents carried her from room to room, their own health beginning to falter under the physical and emotional strain. Anneliese refused food, convinced that consuming anything would strengthen the demons within her. Her weight dropped alarmingly, her once healthy frame reduced to little more than a skeleton. Despite this, she remained resolute. "I must suffer," she told her parents in a rare moment of clarity. "It is the only way." Her words, though heartbreaking, were a source of solace to Joseph and Anna. They believed her suffering had a purpose, that she was chosen by God to endure this trial. But the weight of that belief crushed them nonetheless, leaving them to grapple with an unbearable combination of faith and doubt. As the days grew longer, and the summer heat bore down on the town, the Michel home became an oven of suffering. The priests conducted the exorcisms with the windows shut to prevent prying eyes, the air inside stifling and oppressive. The chants of the Ritual Romanum intermingled with Anneliese's screams, creating a cacophony that seemed to echo endlessly within the walls. During one of the final sessions, Anneliese revealed something that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. "They will not leave me," she said, her voice a rasping whisper. "Not until I die." The priests, desperate for any sign of hope, interpreted her words as a sign that the demons were weakening, that her death would be the final blow against the forces of darkness. But what they failed to see was the toll that death had already begun to take on her. Anneliese was no longer just a young woman possessed. She was a dying woman, her body and mind ravaged by starvation, dehydration, and unrelenting anguish. Her words, spoken with a clarity that had long been absent, were not a sign of victory but a forewarning of the inevitable. On June 30th, 1976, Anneliese requested to attend Mass, a final act of devotion. She was carried to the church by her father, her frail body draped over his shoulder like a child. She could barely speak, her once sharp mind dulled by exhaustion. As the service proceeded, her lips moved silently, forming prayers that only she could hear. It was as though she was already retreating from the world, her spirit withdrawing into the quiet stillness that death would bring. That night the family gathered for one final session. The priests performed the exorcism with a fervor born of desperation, their voices rising and falling in rhythmic cadence. Anneliese, too weak to scream, lay motionless on the bed, her breaths shallow and labored. Her parents knelt beside her, their hands clasped in prayer, tears streaming down their faces. As the session drew to a close, Anneliese spoke her final words, "Mother, I'm afraid." Michel, her heart breaking, cradled her daughter's fragile frame. "We're here, Anneliese," she whispered. "You're safe now." But she wasn't safe. Not from the demons, nor from the choices that had been made in the name of faith. In the early hours of July 1st, 1976, Anneliese Michel took her last breath, her body succumbing to the ravages of starvation and dehydration. She was 23 years old. Her death marked the end of the exorcisms, but the beginning of a firestorm that would engulf her family, the priests, and the church itself. The questions that had loomed over her life. Was she possessed, or was she suffering from a profound mental illness? Would now become the subject of public scrutiny, and the answers, if they existed, would offer little solace to those left behind. Anneliese Michel's story was far from over. Her death would spark a trial that would challenge the very foundations of faith and science, and the echoes of her suffering would reverberate through the years, haunting all who heard her name. The death of Anneliese Michel on July 1st, 1976 was not the end of her story. In many ways it was only the beginning. The events that unfolded after her passing thrust the quiet Bavarian town of Klingenberg into the international spotlight, raising questions about faith, science, and the tragic consequences of conviction. The first ripples began with the autopsy. Medical examiners determined the official cause of death to be malnutrition and dehydration. Anneliese had weighed only 68 pounds at the time of her death, her body frail and wasted after nearly a year of refusing food and water. Her knees were shattered from the hundreds of genuflections she had performed, her body battered by the relentless cycle of physical and spiritual torment. The findings were devastating, painting a picture of prolonged suffering that was difficult for many to comprehend. The state prosecutor quickly launched an investigation. It wasn't long before charges were filed against Anneliese's parents, Joseph and Anna Michel, and the two priests who had performed the exorcisms, Father Ernst Alt and Father Arnold Renz. The charge, negligent homicide. The trial, the first of its kind in modern German history, would become a battle between religion and reason, drawing intense media attention and public debate. The courtroom, located in the nearby city of Aschaffenburg, was packed with spectators when the trial began on March 30th, 1978. Journalists from across the country descended on the town, their cameras and notepads capturing every detail of the proceedings. Among the attendees were curious locals, devout Catholics, and skeptics eager to hear the evidence. At the heart of the trial was a single, agonizing question: was Anneliese Michel possessed, or was she suffering from a severe mental illness? The defense argued that the exorcisms had been performed in good faith, an act of spiritual intervention for a young woman believed to be in the grip of demonic forces. The prosecution countered that Anneliese had been a victim of untreated medical conditions and an extreme religious environment that had compounded her suffering. Tapes of the exorcisms were played in court, offering a chilling glimpse into Anneliese's torment. The audio captured guttural voices that seemed to emanate from deep within her, snarling and growling as they identified themselves as demons Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Cain, Adolf Hitler, and a disgraced priest named Fleischmann. The voices spoke in a low, menacing tone, their words laced with hatred and mockery. "You will never save her," one voice hissed. "She is ours." For the defense, the tapes were proof of possession, evidence of a supernatural struggle that had claimed Anneliese's life. For the prosecution, they were a heartbreaking testament to the psychological and physical toll of her untreated illnesses. Experts testified that Anneliese had likely suffered from a combination of temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, and psychosis, conditions that would have explained her hallucinations, her compulsive behaviors, and her inability to eat. The trial was not just about Anneliese Michel, it was about the collision of two worlds, one rooted in faith and ancient rites, the other in science and modern medicine. The judges were tasked with navigating these opposing forces, weighing the evidence against the deeply held beliefs of the defendants. Father Alt and Father Renz took the stand, their faces drawn and weary. They spoke of their conviction that Anneliese had been possessed, describing the horrors they had witnessed during the exorcisms. They argued that her suffering had a purpose, that she had chosen to endure the torment as an act of atonement for the sins of others. She wanted to save lost souls, Father Alt said, his voice trembling. She believed it was her duty. Anneliese's parents, too, maintained their belief in her possession. Anna Michel, her face lined with grief, told the court that she had seen the stigmata appear on her daughter's hands, a sign she believed was from God. "We did what we thought was right," she said. "We followed our faith." But the testimony of medical experts painted a starkly different picture. Neurologists and psychiatrists described a young woman in the throes of mental illness, her symptoms exacerbated by the lack of proper treatment. They argued that her hallucinations and compulsions were not the work of demons, but the manifestations of a troubled mind. One doctor, who had treated Anneliese before the exorcisms began, testified that her death could have been prevented if she had been hospitalized and fed intravenously. The verdict came on April 21, 1978. All 4 defendants were found guilty of negligent homicide. The priests received suspended 6-month prison sentences and were placed on probation for 3 years. Anneliese's parents were spared any punishment, as the court ruled that they had already suffered enough. The sentences were controversial, seen by some as too lenient and by others as too harsh. For the church, the trial was a moment of reckoning. The public scrutiny brought by the case forced Catholic leaders to reevaluate the practice of exorcism, leading to stricter guidelines and a greater emphasis on medical evaluation. Bishop Joseph Stangl, who had authorized the exorcism, later stated that he had not been fully aware of Anneliese's condition and expressed regret over the events. In the years that followed, Anneliese Michel's grave became a site of pilgrimage for those who believed in her sanctity. Visitors left flowers and notes praying for her intercession. Some saw her as a martyr, a young woman who had sacrificed her life to combat the forces of evil. Others viewed her as a tragic figure, a victim of misplaced faith and untreated illness. Her story inspired books, documentaries, and films, most notably The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which brought her case to a global audience. But for those who had known her, the legacy of her life and death was far more personal. It was a story of a young woman who had struggled with unimaginable pain, a family torn apart by grief, and a community forever haunted by the question of what might have been. Today, the house in Klingenberg where Anneliese died stands quiet, its shutters closed against the world. The neighbors rarely speak of her, their memories of those dark days buried under years of silence. But for those who pass her grave, the story of Anneliese Michel remains a chilling reminder of the thin line between faith and fear, belief and despair. Her story is not just a tale of possession or illness. It is a testament to the power of conviction and the devastating consequences that can arise when the boundaries of faith and science collide. It is a story that continues to resonate, its echoes heard in every whispered prayer, every unanswered question, and every quiet moment of doubt. And it is a story that, like the shadowed whispers of the demons she fought, will never truly fade,